We have three key managers, part of different clusters. Now the name list is bringing all the different clusters together under same umbrella. We will decide which queue manager and which cluster we want to make it as a name list. So when we decide a queue manager as a full repository, what do we do? Alter queue manager repos. Alter queue manager repos for the QM1 and QM3. Whereas for QM2, we alter the queue manager attribute, which is called REPOSNL. We have one cluster sender and cluster receiver at QM1. We have cluster sender and cluster receiver at QM3. Whereas in QM2, what we have two sender channels like this one, which I already drawn a diagram, and this one. Cluster 2 will be having a two cluster sender channels for QM1 and QM3. And at the same time, it is getting information from QM3 and QM1. Let's, I hope the concept is clear for you. We'll give a walkthrough through the commands. Can someone give a walkthrough here? Narmada, can you give the walkthrough?
Yes, Akbar. So here what we did is we had cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3, cluster 4, in which we made cluster 1 and cluster 2 as repository. Then what we did, we have a sender and receiver channel in a cluster 1 and cluster 2. So here cluster 1 will know about the cluster 2. So what we will have, it will have the sender channel to cluster 2 and the receiver channel, its own cluster 1. That is the first step we are doing in a queue manager 1, that is cluster 1. Then in cluster 2, in same, like we have a same receiver channel, that is QM2, and the sender channel is QM1, that is a cluster 1. And also to the cluster 3, which is queue manager 3. Here for here the repository is cluster 1. So sorry Akbar, like in our example we made cluster 1 and cluster 2 as repository.
Cluster 1, 2, and 3. Correct.
In our in our example we had two cluster, like 4 cluster, and in which we made cluster 1 and cluster 2 as repository. Here we are doing like cluster 1 as a repository and cluster 2
No,
and cluster 3 or
that you are talking about cluster concept. We make 4 queue managers and
okay,
2 as a full repository, 2 as a partial repository.
partial repository.
You
Okay,
are
okay.
talking about cluster concept. Now this is communication
Nameless.
across multiple clusters. That you talked about
Okay.
communication within the cluster.
Got
You
it.
got the
Got
point?
it.
You are taking an example
Yes,
of
yes, sir.
4 queue managers, correct?
Yes, yes.
That is the
So,
example
what
of
we are doing?
cluster.
Got it. Got it. So now in this scenario, like we made so in cluster 1 we made a sender and receiver channel. Like sender channel is QM2 and receiver channel is QM1 itself. That is cluster 1 itself. So in cluster 2, which is the which have sender channel towards QM1 and QM3 and its own receiver channel.
Okay.
In name
Riaz,
list, it will have.
yeah, that's
Yes,
fine.
sir.
I got the concept. Riaz, can you explain what we are trying to achieve here?
NL naming. Here we are having cluster 1 and cluster 2 and the cluster 3. Yeah, one is N1 and what is this? Naming list. Cluster 1 and cluster 2 will be the naming list, and the cluster 3 and the cluster 1 will be repos.
Okay, let me explain. See, what we are trying to achieve here is we are trying to achieve the communication between the three key managers, which are part of three different clusters. That is what very important here. Now, when you make a communication across multiple clusters, you need to decide which cluster is the boss. Like for example, in cluster, you have four key managers. You need to decide which are the full repositories. Like in the same way, for a name list also, who is the boss? The boss, for the boss, all the juniors will send information. Like cluster 1 and cluster 3 in my example are not the boss here. Cluster 2 is the boss. So as the cluster 2 is a boss, we are deciding the cluster receiver channel at a name list level, and we are defining the name list. When we are defining the name list, we are telling cluster 1, 2, and 3 are part of name list level. So all these clusters, for example, if you have 5 clusters, then I have to give cluster 4, for example, cluster 4, cluster 5, cluster 6, like this. In case I have more clusters, I have to increase the clusters. What we need to observe is when you talk about the queue manager, which is part of cluster level, you have queue manager attribute repos. But when you talk about name list level, this is called REPOSNL. And when you define a name list, define name list N1, cluster 1 and cluster 2 and cluster 3. So I have made the decision of unique ports because we have already have some other ports in our environment. Okay. So I'm proceeding with the lab now. Hope we are clear about the architecture diagram and the commands what we are going to use. Any questions, guys? Because I'm proceeding with the name list concept. We are going to see the lab. The agenda is when you make this setup communication, your channels should run and your objects should be accessible from anywhere. Am I clear? Because doing lab is not important. Architecture diagram and framing the commands is very important. Okay. So what is our first step here is we need to define the queue manager, which is called QM1. ERT, MGM, UMGR, 4 ones, okay? ERT, MGM, UMGR, 4 tools. ERT, MGM, UMGR. So I created 3 queue managers. I'm starting them. So as soon as I define the queue managers, what is my immediate next step? I have to define the listener, correct? So let's review the command of defining the listener. So the same step I have to do in all the key managers. Define listener lsn dot qmgr into trptype tcp port 42s.
Yes.
Run mqsc qmgr 33. Define listeners lsn dot qmgr 333 trptype tcp port 43s. Okay, I have created a queue managers. I have created a listeners for all the queue managers. What is my next step? I have to decide which queue manager is part of which cluster. For that, I'll go to QMGR 111, alter QMGR, repos. I'll make sure this is part of cluster 1. Or you want to keep 4 ones? That could be better. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Correct. Better, right? That could be better. Run MQSC, QMGR, 4 trees, alter QMGR, repos, CLUSTER, 4 trees. Okay. QM1 and QM3 are like a part of individual cluster. Now I want the key manager 2. That's why I have not yet proceed further. Now I'll be deciding this queue manager as a boss. 4 twos, right? Alter. See, if you can see display QMGR, you have both attributes, repos and REPOSNL. By default, you have both. Okay. Which one you want to use? If you are using attribute of repos, means this queue manager is part of cluster. If you are using REPOSNL, means this queue manager is part of multiple clusters. This is a boss. That's what you have to observe the difference. If you go to QM1 and QM3, they are just part of repos only. They are not part of REPOSNL. If you want, you can come out. You can go to QMGR11. You check the same thing here. REPOSNL. See, it's part of a cluster 1. REPOSNL is blank for QM11. If you go to display QMGR, REPOSNL. See here what's happening. Both are blank because we have not yet decided anything. Because this is a bus. We have to alter which attribute? REPOSNL. Correct? Alter QMGR REPOSNL. What is the name list name that you want to give here? What we have decided? REPOSNL. REPOS name is giving as N1. The same name you have to define when you are defining N1. As I'm using here the attribute as N1, I have to define it, right? Define name list in the bracket. What is the name list name we have to give? Whatever we are giving here in the REPOSNL, the same thing we have to use here. Define name list name, and then names. Cluster 1, cluster 2, and cluster 3. That's it. Name list. 4 ones. Okay. Now you have how many name list? Sorry, how many clusters?
Here we
3
get
clusters.
We have three, but in Queue Manager 2, we have now created this cluster 2, right? We have only given REPOSNL. Will it take automatically?
We will give at at the time of creation of channels.
Okay, okay, okay.
Define name list, cluster 1, 2, 3. Define name list. Oh, sorry, my bad. See, this is what we have to observe when we are typing the syntax. We have to give it as a names. Okay. Now let us cross check once again. Run MQSC, QMGR, display QMGR, REPOSNL. For Q Manager 1 is part of REPOS. Perfect. QMGR3, REPOSNL. It's part of cluster 3. Perfect. Display QMGR, REPOSNL. It's part of, no, sorry. I have to type QMGR2. Now this is at name list level. So now what is our main agenda? In cluster 1, if you take, what we have to do? Have to point to QM2 cluster sender channel has to define that cluster 2 level. Have to define a cluster 1 channel as a receiver channel, its own level, which means I'll write it here. 2 dot QMGR 22 is a class SDR, which is at okay, let's see how it goes. 2 dot QMGR 111 plus RCVR cluster 1. So Narmada, your question could be like if we are deciding a cluster center channel to cluster 2, but we have not defined a cluster 2 at QM2, right?
Yes, yes, sir.
Correct. That's a valid question. Okay, let's see. The syntax says this is what the process is. Let's see how it goes. We will define from QM1 to QM2, QM3 to QM2 because QM2 is a boss. As of now, we'll proceed as per the syntax. Okay. Now here, the definition is same here. We will edit as per our requirement. Cluster receiver 4 is QM1. Yeah, one port. Okay, fine. So we are we are clear with the definitions of cluster sender and cluster receiver. And we are going to execute in QM1. From QM1, the channel is pointing to QM2, which is a class sender. The con name is localhost. Why we are giving localhost? Because this is our local system. We are giving localhost. Whereas in real time, we will give the IP address instead of localhost. And this is a port of QM2. Correct? As our channel is pointing to QM2, we have to give the port of. And this is part of cluster 2. We are telling that QM2 is part of cluster 2. We are defining the receiver channel here. 2.qm1 cluster receiver channel, its own local host and cluster of cluster. So we are done with the definition set. We are done with the definition set. QMGR1. Run MQSC QMGR photos. Now what we need to do, we need to get ready with the commands here as per our definition. I'll copy paste again. I'll change it as per our requirement. Four ones. I'll remove this OLC. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay. The whole concept in MQ is your architecture diagram and your commands. That's it. Your game is over. Define channel, cluster sender, TCP, call name, cluster, cluster receiver, name list level. Here I have to remove this OLC. Cluster receiver. So I'm going to execute. So you guys are familiar with these commands, right? From QM2, the communication is going to both the sides. From QM2, it has to go to QM1, and from QM2, it has to go to QM3. So that's why we are having here two cluster center channels. See, 1, 2. From QM2, two cluster center channels are going to point to other Q images which are part of other clusters, cluster 1 and cluster 3. So now I'll give here, this is a syntax. Now I'll work on this. QM33 or QMGR33 or, oh no. Oh. Ours is like QMGR. One minute. Yeah, sorry. QMGR, because our queue manager name is QMGR. One minute, guys. Give me 1 minute. So, guys, you observe the difference here. Our queue manager name is QMGR 41s. But when we are defining a channels, I have given QM22. So, I have to frame the QMGR1, QMGR 42s, cluster receiver, QMGR1, QMGR 1, 2, 3, 1. After this, we'll join the next meeting, okay? Two dot, yeah, two dot QMGR, two dot QMGR, two dot QMGR2. Okay, now I have to go to now we have three definitions at QMGR 42s, which is one pointing to QM1, which is the other one is pointing to QM3, and the receiver channel of its QMGR22 pointing at namelist level. Okay, all good. Now we have to check on, we have defined the name list also, right? Define names, display names, display name list star, display name list. Oh no, why there's a lot of confusion here? When we are defining the, am I following two documents here? Cluster 1, 2, 3 we are giving. in the name list also we have to give cluster 1, 2, 3. Okay, alter name list N1 names cluster 1, cluster 2, and cluster 3. Okay, now the name list is clear. Now we have changed the name list here as per this. So now we have to go to 1, 2, 3. Okay. One, two, three, 4. Yeah, the rest of all same. Cluster 2 and cluster 3. Cluster and the cluster receiver. 2 channels. Random QC. Cluster center channel. QM3 pointing to this host. Pointing to cluster 2. Cluster sender. This is at cluster receivers. QM3 cluster receiver TCP cluster 3. Correct? So all our requirement is clear. Guys, I hope you are with me. I know this is a bit confusing. So our queue manager name is QMGR11. As per our architecture diagram, QMGR1 needs 2 channels and QMGR3 needs 2 channels. Let us cross check that first. Display CH star, CHL type, you can give command like this, where channel type equal to CLUSSDR. You don't want to see any other channels. You want to see only cluster center channels in QMGR11. See how many are there? You have to ignore this QM42s. Our channel is QMGR22. One cluster center channel we have. Now in the same way, if I have to see cluster receiver, where CHL type equal to plus RCVR. Two dot QMGR11 plus receiver. Okay. So 2 channels are decided. QMGR 3 will go. We need to have one cluster center channel and we need to have one cluster receiver channel. This is perfect. So whereas in QM run MQSC, QMGR 2, how many we need? 3, correct? 2 cluster center and 1 cluster receiver. cluster sender to QM3, cluster sender to QM1, cluster receiver to QM2. Now I can go ahead and start the listener. Before that, I want to cross-check whether the listener is defined on all the key managers or not. lsn.qmgr11 display LISTE NER lsn.qmgr 1 2 3 4. Okay, qmgr photos display LISTE NER lsn.qmgr photos. See, you can see the port, right? 4 1s, 4 2s. That's what we are checking here. Four threes. So all our listeners are there. So first I will start the listener in both QMGR 1 and 3. Start LSTENER